So I said last lecture that time travel creates some paradoxes, right? And we might mean different things by paradoxes. On the one hand, you might mean something that's just really weird, but you also might mean something that is logically contradictory. And if time travel generates a paradox in the sense of logically contradictory, that's a good reason to think that time travel can't happen, right? We might think that time travel seems like consistent. It might not be as obviously logically contradictory as the four-sided triangle. But if it generates a logical contradiction, we might say, well, we just didn't think things through enough. When we try to think time travel through a bit more, we see that it does generate logical contradictions. And the most famous logical contradiction that time travel seems to create, and I think the main one, I think a lot of the others are just kind of variations on this, is the so-called grandfather paradox. This seems to show to some people that time travel is logically contradictory, and it will show at the very least that a lot of ways we think of time travel are logically contradictory. Okay, so how's the grandfather paradox supposed to work? So, let's say that this guy, Max, really hates his grandfather and has a time machine. I think Max is the name that Dyke uses in her article, so we'll just go with it. Suppose Max really hates his grandfather and Max gets his hands on a time machine, right? Max decides to go back and shoot his grandfather when his grandfather is a young man, right? He's going to shoot his grandfather. Let's say for whatever reason, Max thinks that his grandfather traumatized his dad horribly. Also mean to him. So Max is like, I'm going to go back and shoot this guy before he has a chance to do any of this, right? So he goes back. He's going to shoot his grandfather before his grandfather has a chance to traumatize his father. And to make sure he does this, he's going to shoot his grandfather before he even, has his young, father, before he even impregnates grandmother with Max's father, right? Let's shoot grandfather when he's young, right? Now, the way I've set this up, if Max shoots his grandfather before his grandfather even, plays his part in conceiving Max's father, well, give that a little bit of thought. Why shooting, the grandfather will create a logical contradiction. Give you guys like 3 seconds or so to think about this. It's not a trick question. This is a pretty easy one to solve, right? Well, because if Max shot his grandfather before his grandfather could father Max's father won't exist. If Max's father doesn't exist, then Max's father cannot father Max, so Max won't exist, right? If Max doesn't exist, he couldn't shoot his grandfather. So, if Max shoots his grandfather, then Max won't exist, but if Max doesn't exist, he can't shoot his grandfather, right? So, this very quickly leads to a contradiction. If Max shoots his grandfather, Max can't exist. If Max doesn't exist, Max can't shoot his grandfather. Now, the grandfather paradox is the most famous version of this, but there's a general problem here as far as deliberately changing the past in any way goes. Dyke actually talks about a few variations of these, right? Let's say you were bored horribly on your 21st birthday, so 30-year-old you decides to go back and give 21-year-old you a great time. I'll take you out, like whatever. Well, if you succeeded, then your birthday would no longer have been boring. Then you would no longer have any reason to travel into the past to make sure you didn't have a boring birthday. If you want to stop some horrible historical event, like let's say Hitler's rise to power in Germany, you go find Hitler wandering the streets of Vienna in the 20s and, do him in, right? Come on, it's Hitler. Nobody would have a problem killing Hitler, right? Even in the 20s, Hitler was a very nasty, horrible, horrible person. Not like there was any magical change in Hitler's character from being an okay dude to being a monster. Hitler was always pretty terrible, right? So you kill 1920s Hitler, he never has a chance to be the, absolute dictator of Germany and kill millions. Well, the problem in this case is, again, if you kill Hitler and he never becomes the dictator, then future you would have no reason to kill Hitler, right? The only reason you have to kill Hitler is because he became a dictator. So if you kill him, he'll never become a dictator. And if he never becomes a dictator, you would never have any reason to travel through time and kill him. So again, if you kill him, you won't kill him. So again, you get a contradiction. In it all, Dyke's version is I think the Archduke Ferdinand, in World War One. But the basic thought is if you actually change the past, then in the future you would have no reason to change the past in the first place, so you wouldn't travel through time. If you change the past, you won't travel through time, so you won't change the past. You end up with a logical contradiction here. So changing the past intentionally generates a logical contradiction, or it seems to. But just generally, people think that, even over and above this obvious logical contradiction, it seems like you couldn't accidentally change the past either, right? I mean, for one thing, even minor changes in the past seem like they could ripple forwards. You go to 1920s Vienna without any intention of killing Hitler. You just want to see what Vienna was like in the 20s. You accidentally knock this ill-kempt man with a stupid mustache in front of a streetcar, runs him over. Well, look, major historical events like that. If there were no Hitler, history would change in a huge way. If history changed in a huge way, there's a pretty good chance that none of us, or at least most of us, wouldn't exist, right? In a world where the U.S. never fought World War II, or, Hitler never rose to power in Germany, history would have turned out a lot different. If history turned out a lot different, you and I probably wouldn't be around, right? I mean, think of how improbable it is that your parents met, And even if your parents conceived you at a different time, it wouldn't be you because it has to be the same sperm and egg. So any big historical change very likely going to ripple outwards and mean that we don't exist, right? If I don't exist, I can't travel through time to accidentally knock Hitler in front of that streetcar, right? Beyond all that, though, there's just the logical problems that Taylor talked about. The past does seem to be set. All these statements hold about the past. We can't do anything to change them. And not only does this show that we can't travel, that traveling in time creates problems, it seems that communicating with the past would also create the same problems, right? Let's say, that I can't travel in time, but I create a device that allows me to communicate with the past, right? I'm talking to this guy in 1960, he's talking about how great this new president Kennedy is. I guess Kennedy wasn't quite president, he'd just been elected even at the end of the 60s. and I say, well, if you like this dude, you better get, here's this thing you might want to do something about, right? I couldn't even send that information into the past because if I changed the past and Kennedy wasn't shot, I would have no reason to warn this guy, hey, don't let this happen, right? Well, look, does this show that you couldn't change? So all this does show that you can't change the past. You can't even change the past by communicating with it. And I think that the grandfather paradox does show that a lot of the ways we think about time travel and a lot of the ways it's presented in movies is not logically consistent. It's not possible. I liked Back to the Future growing up. I don't know how well it would stand up if I watched it again, right? But, Back to the Future, they're always changing the past so the future turns out better. Mainly it seems so people are more popular. I don't know. You can definitely tell this was a movie aimed at younger people. The great change to the future is your dad is no longer as dorky as he used to be, right? But you couldn't even do that. Marty almost makes it the case that his parents don't meet. He couldn't do that because, again, you get these paradoxes, right? Movies like Looper, I like Looper a lot better. I think it's a cool movie. But even there, where, angry old Bruce Willis travels into the past to try to stop something from happening and meets his angry but not quite as angry younger Joseph Gordon-Levitt self, ends up changing the past in various ways that I won't give away if you guys want to see the movie, which it is pretty good. Even that also seems logically contradictory. It seems consistent to us that you could do this, you could change the past, but when you think it through, it is not, in fact, consistent. Well, all of this means that one way we think about time travel, the guy going into the past and changing things either intentionally or unintentionally, is not consistent. Does that mean that time travel is not possible? Maybe not, right? What it does mean is that if you were to travel into the past with the intent to change the past, you would inevitably fail. You could travel into the past, perhaps. The idea of traveling into the past does not generate a logical contradiction. It's only changing the past that generates logical contradictions. So, we can confidently say that if you travel into the past with the intent to change it, you will inevitably fail. There's nothing logically contradictory about Max traveling back in time with the intent of murdering his grandfather, seeing his grandfather, pulling out the pistol, emptying the pistol in his grandfather's general direction and missing every single time, right? Maybe this is the reason grandfather was such a jerk. Some rando when he was a boy shot at him with a pistol 6 times and he's been, suffering from that his whole life, right? I go in the past to kill Hitler. I go and I observe Hitler for all this time. I see that he's always wearing this coat. I bonk some guy in the head coming out of some place that's wearing Hitler's coat. Lo and behold, maybe Hitler has, in an uncharacteristic moment of generosity, lent his coat to somebody, and I've killed that guy, right? There is nothing logically contradictory about that. Going into the past and intentionally changing it, logically contradictory. Going into the past with the intent to change it and failing is not. So what we can say is, if traveling into the past is possible, any attempt to change it will fail. But with that sort of little qualification, it does seem that traveling into the past is logically consistent. Here's the problem, though. To maintain logical consistency, if you travel into the past and try to change it, you must fail. But why? Why is that? And yes, you can tell me logical consistency, but in a lot of cases where changing the past should be easy, you can't change it, but what is it that keeps you from changing the past? Here's an example from this German show, Dark, which actually, at least in the early seasons, did present a coherent view of time travel. So, one of the characters, this kid Jonas, finds out that he's going to become this horrible mass murderer. He's going to generate this horrible event that he wants to avoid. And, he comes to this realization. He's like, well, okay, if 70-year-old me is going to do this terrible, terrible thing that my whole life has been dedicated to stopping, basically, in the world, why can't I, by this point he's 40, he's like, okay, why can't 40-year-old Jonas just shoot himself in the head and stop this, right? He can't, because that would generate a logical contradiction, but the reason he can't is inexplicable. It seems perfectly possible that he could just lay down in front of a train or shoot himself or whatever, right? We know he can't, but is there some kind of magic stopping him, right? And in the show, and this is why I say in the early seasons, Jonas doesn't realize that these things he's doing are setting the future that he hates in motion, but eventually he figures it out. And, the show, I think, to kind of cheat, they're like, well, look, if he's so dedicated, why doesn't he just kill himself? And there's this scene where he takes a loaded gun, puts it to his head, pulls the trigger 5 times, and the gun doesn't go off, right? Then he points it at a wall, the sixth shell magically goes off, right? But look, we know he can't shoot himself because that's logically contradictory. But why not, right? I mean, is there some kind of magic that's stopping him from breaking the laws of logic, right? I mean, that's the way the show kind of portrays it, and I think, I don't know if people still use this phrase, and I think that's the exact moment where it, as they would say, jumps the shark, right? There seems to be some magical force keeping this guy from breaking the laws of logic. If he goes and tries to lay down in front of a train, is the train going to magically levitate over him or something, right? So here's where I think things get weird. There are consistent time travel stories, but they either avoid this point. The people who go into the past don't know about it, and there's some dramatic irony. They try to change the past and end up creating the past they hate. Or they cheat, right? Weird magical stuff happens to keep the person from changing the past. Dark is one example, right? The gun just won't go off. And Ted Chiang, the author I'm having you guys read for this section, he has another story. I actually think maybe a better story than the one I'm having you guys read. It's just longer and a bit more complicated. But he has this one, The Story of Your Life, right? And the setup here, they actually made this into a really good movie called Arrival. But the setup here is that these aliens come to Earth. This woman, famous linguist, is working with this, I think he's a physicist or a mathematician, to decipher the aliens' language. As they decipher the language, they come to find out that the aliens don't experience time the way we do. They actually can see into the future. And it turns out, according to the story, that by learning the alien's language, this woman gains the ability to see into the future herself. Well, one of the problems here, the main problem is, by seeing into the future, she realizes that her daughter will die in her 20s in a rock climbing accident. She also sees that she'll marry the mathematician in the story, or the physicist, I can't remember which, and that they'll have, like, I think, a somewhat messy divorce. Um, but the main one being, that the daughter they have will die in her 20s in a rock climbing accident. Well, it seems like really easy. If your daughter, whom you love a lot, as she does in the story, is going to die in a rock climbing accident, all you need to do on that particular weekend is to say, hey, sweetie, please don't go on this rock climbing expedition, or make up an excuse, do something else with it, right? Or maybe as you're raising your kid, this might be a meaner way to do it. I don't know if this is great parenting, but somehow instill an incredible fear of rock climbing into your child, right? This is a thing we don't do. Why doesn't the woman in the story try to do this? Well, on this point, Chiang cheats too, right? Or he seems to me to cheat. The woman says, well, when you learn the language of these aliens and it allows you to see in the future, part of learning the language is that you lose all desire to change the future. And I'm like, really? No, right? I mean, language might determine the way you think a little bit. There's a debate here. But it just seems to me kind of preposterous. Like, oh yeah, this language will change the way you think so much that one of the things you would want most in the world to avoid, the death of your beloved daughter, you're now going to be like, meh. It's supposed to happen, it's supposed to happen, right? I mean, Chang's a good writer, so he sells it, kind of. But it's one of those, like, being a good writer, he sells it, and then a day later you're like, wait. No, right? It seems to me he's cheating too, in the same way Dark cheats. Maybe not quite as blatantly. He sells it a little better, but still. So my point with all this is this. It seems that you can travel in time and not generate logical contradictions as long as you don't change the past. But in a lot of cases, the reason that you don't change the past, obviously if you do, it would generate logical contradictions, so you can't do it. But there's no explanation for why changing the past is impossible, right? Obviously you can't do it, but why? And these stories, the fact that they have to cheat to maintain logical consistency, that they either, there's a weird force that somehow makes the gun not go off, or magically by learning to see in the future you lose any desire to change the future. The fact that they have to cheat to avoid logical inconsistency makes me think that there's something very weird about time travel. This isn't quite logical impossibility, but it makes me think that time travel might turn out to be impossible in this sense of metaphysical impossibility, that to make it logically consistent, things would have to be so weird that easily accomplishable things become impossible, or you lose the desire to do things you would obviously want to do. I mean, I can't neatly generate a contradiction here. The fact that you have to posit this weird force maintaining the past as it was, or you seem to, just to avoid logical contradiction, that seems to me a reason to think that maybe time travel, just as a whole, isn't possible. Again, I can't generate a contradiction, it's just, to me, this seems to be evidence against. Okay, so next lecture we're going to talk about another fun paradox of time travel. This one doesn't generate a logical contradiction even from the get-go, but it is very, very weird. And this weirdness might be another reason to think time travel isn't possible. So next time we'll talk about the so-called bootstrapping paradox.